The house was too quiet that evening, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until your own breathing feels like a betrayal. I remember standing in the hallway, my fingers brushing the cold wall, trying to convince myself that the weight in my chest was nothing more than exhaustion. But I knew better. It was the echo of a secret I'd been carrying for weeks, one I hadn't dared to give a name. The door at the end of the hall was closed, and behind it, my life waited in a version I barely recognized anymore. I told myself I was just lonely. That it was normal to feel invisible when the person you promised forever to stopped really seeing you. Our conversations had become transactions: who would pick up groceries, whose turn it was to pay the bills, what needed fixing around the house. The soft laughter, the stolen glances, the warmth of shared mornings had faded into something functional and dull. I didn't want to admit how much that hurt, so I wrapped it in silence and pretended I was fine. Then there was them, a presence that slipped into my life so quietly I didn't notice the shift until everything felt different. It started with small things, messages that lingered a little longer than necessary, questions that felt too personal for casual talk, the way my name sounded when they said it. I should have pulled back. I knew the rules. I knew the lines that weren't meant to be crossed. But loneliness is a powerful thing, and when someone offers you a mirror where you finally recognize yourself again, it's hard to look away. That night, I found myself pacing the living room, my phone warm in my hand from a conversation I shouldn't have been having. The words on the screen were harmless on their own, but together they formed a bridge I didn't know how to burn. I could feel my heart beating faster, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to excitement. That realization scared me more than anything else. I sat down, staring at the reflection of myself in the darkened window. The person looking back didn't seem like a villain, just someone tired of being unseen. I whispered my own name out loud, as if saying it might anchor me back to who I used to be. It didn't work. The silence answered instead. The sound of footsteps broke the moment. Not loud, not rushed, just a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I felt. My breath caught, and for a split second, I imagined the door opening, the truth spilling out before I had a chance to hide it. But nothing happened. The steps faded, and I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling in my lap. I thought about the first time I'd noticed the shift in myself. It was subtle, almost innocent. A laugh I hadn't heard in years escaped me during a conversation that felt too easy, too natural. I remembered how my chest tightened afterward, not from joy, but from guilt. That was when I knew something inside me had already crossed a line, even if my body hadn't followed. The guilt didn't stop me, though. It sat beside me like a quiet companion, watching as I typed another message, as I smiled at words meant for someone who wasn't mine to lean on. I told myself I deserved to feel alive again. I told myself it was harmless, just a distraction from the dull ache of my own life. Deep down, I knew those were lies I repeated until they almost sounded like truth. The night grew heavier, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes, letting memories wash over me, how things used to be, how love once felt like a promise instead of a responsibility. I wondered when exactly that changed, when we stopped reaching for each other and started reaching for excuses. My phone buzzed again. I didn't look at it right away. I let it sit there, glowing softly, like a temptation I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. When I finally picked it up, my hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. The message was simple, but the meaning behind it was anything but. It was an invitation, not to a place, but to a possibility. I stood up, walking back to the hallway, the same hallway that felt like a line between two versions of my life. On one side, the familiar comfort of a relationship that had grown quiet and distant. On the other, the thrill of being seen again, of being wanted in a way I'd forgotten existed. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the steady pulse in my wrist, reminding myself that every choice I made from this moment forward would ripple through everything I cared about. I didn't make a decision that night. Not out loud, at least. But as I turned back toward the living room, my phone still in my hand, I knew something inside me had already shifted. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the calm before something I couldn't take back, a secret waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. The days that followed were a blur of careful routines and stolen moments. I told myself I was cautious, that I was keeping everything contained, but the truth was that each small interaction felt like walking a tightrope over a pit I couldn't see the bottom of. Every glance, every word, every pause between messages carried weight. I had grown used to thinking of consequences, yet here I was, letting desire quietly dictate my actions, convincing myself that curiosity was harmless. There was an electric tension in the way my thoughts lingered on things I shouldn't have imagined. I found myself laughing at jokes that weren't really funny, lingering on comments that should have passed unnoticed, and noticing the small details, the way their voice caught on certain words, the way their eyes would focus on me for just a moment too long. I had trained myself to look away, but my mind refused. It circled around these moments like a predator, relentless and consuming. I started planning when I would be alone. Not in a way that was reckless, but calculated. My heart raced every time I imagined a quiet hour with my phone in hand, a window open to a world I didn't belong to. I could feel guilt in the back of my skull, a persistent hum that reminded me of everything at stake. Yet, every time it surfaced, I found myself brushing it aside, telling myself that it was only a pause in my lonely life, a harmless diversion from a world that had grown gray. Messages became longer, more deliberate. Conversations stretched into hours when I had nothing urgent to attend to. Each word I typed was a test of boundaries, a subtle exploration of how far I could go without breaking everything I'd built. I found exhilaration in restraint, a thrill in keeping secrets that could shatter trust in an instant. I justified it by telling myself that I wasn't doing anything tangible, only existing in a space where my heart felt alive again. Sleep became unpredictable. Nights stretched longer than they should, my thoughts refusing to quiet. I would lie awake, replaying moments in my mind, dissecting each interaction, each smile, each pause. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I was crossing an invisible line, yet the pull of connection, of feeling seen, was stronger than caution. I began to understand the paradox I had created. The more I tried to maintain control, the deeper I sank into the tension. There were instances when reality hit sharply. A message arrived that could not be ignored, or a glance caught me off guard, and I felt the sting of fear. Not fear of discovery, but fear of losing control. My body reacted before my mind could, adrenaline spiking, heartbeat loud and undeniable. These moments were brief but powerful reminders that the situation I had created was dangerous in a way I couldn't fully measure. I started noticing how this connection changed me. I became sharper in some ways, more aware of subtle cues in conversation, more sensitive to emotions that I had previously overlooked. But alongside that awareness was a gnawing anxiety, a constant sense that I was balancing on the edge of something irreversible. Every choice, every word, every pause was now loaded with consequence. I had become my own observer, watching how I navigated this hidden tension while knowing the walls around me were fragile. Despite the fear and guilt, there was an undeniable magnetism. I found myself craving interaction even when I knew it would complicate everything. Each new message carried the same dangerous excitement, and I welcomed it despite understanding the potential fallout. I was aware of every line I was crossing, and yet, in those moments, the awareness itself became part of the thrill. The internal struggle grew sharper with every passing day. Part of me wanted to step back, to restore a sense of order and distance. Another part of me resisted, insisting that this connection had awakened something vital within me, something I hadn't felt in years. I realized that desire and fear could coexist, feeding one another in a cycle that was impossible to escape. By the end of the week, the tension had become almost unbearable. I was more attentive, more cautious, yet more drawn in than ever. Each interaction felt like an experiment in self-control, each message a test of how far I could go before everything I knew came crashing down. And though I couldn't admit it openly, a part of me secretly hoped it wouldn't end anytime soon, knowing that the consequences, however inevitable, were now part of the price of feeling alive again. The breaking point didn't arrive suddenly, it crept up, subtle and relentless, until the weight of everything I'd been carrying could no longer be ignored. I realized that the careful balance I'd maintained was unraveling. Every glance, every message, every stolen moment had piled up into a tension that pressed on my chest so heavily it was impossible to ignore. The thrill I had chased had begun to transform into a gnawing anxiety that threatened to consume me entirely. I started noticing the cracks in my own resolve. Simple decisions became complicated, choosing when to respond, how to phrase a sentence, even how to occupy myself without falling back into temptation. I found myself scanning for signs that I had been discovered, reading between lines that were never meant to conceal anything. Every interaction now carried double meaning in my mind, even when none existed. I understood that I was teetering on a precipice, yet there was a part of me that couldn't step back. The moments of guilt grew sharper, almost physical. I felt them in the tightening of my chest, the tremor in my hands, the restless pacing late at night. I replayed my own actions repeatedly, imagining how someone else might interpret them, and the shame burned hotter with each repetition. There was no longer comfort in the secrecy itself had become a trap, a mirror reflecting a version of myself I didn't want to see. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that I was only human, that seeking connection was a natural response to isolation, that I wasn't hurting anyone. But rationalizations fell flat against the vividness of my own conscience. I couldn't deny that the line I had promised never to cross was no longer just a possibility, it had already been approached, and every step beyond it would have consequences I wasn't sure I could handle. Sleep became impossible. My mind would not allow quiet. Each night was filled with endless loops of what-ifs, each scenario more plausible and terrifying than the last. I imagined confessions, confrontations, the subtle but unmistakable shifts in the faces of those I cared about. Anxiety gnawed at my stomach, leaving me restless, irritable, and hyper-aware of every sound, every vibration of the phone that had become both my lifeline and my curse. Then came the realization that what I had considered harmless flirtation was no longer contained. The intimacy of our exchanges had created an emotional tether that pulled at me in ways I couldn't ignore. I felt exposed even in my solitude, as if my private thoughts were now dangerous weapons. Every attempt to regain composure only heightened the tension, and the thrill that had once been exciting now carried the weight of inevitable consequence. I noticed subtle shifts in myself. The excitement I had chased had become a source of self-doubt and hypervigilance. My reactions were no longer spontaneous, they were calculated, measured, and defensive. I found myself anticipating judgment in situations that hadn't occurred, interpreting innocent remarks as tests or traps. The emotional energy I had been pouring into another person had started to leave me depleted, emotionally raw, and anxious. The complexity of what I had created became clear. I was trapped between desire and responsibility, craving connection while fearing exposure. Each day became a negotiation between those opposing forces, with no clear way to reconcile them. The secrecy that had once felt empowering now felt like chains, and the cost of indulgence was etched clearly in every thought, every moment of internal struggle. By midweek, my reflection in the mirror became a stranger. I could no longer identify the person staring back at me. The image was fragmented, a mixture of guilt, longing, and fear. I realized that I had allowed myself to be consumed by this tension, that it had grown beyond a fleeting temptation into a force shaping my entire emotional state. I knew something had to change, yet I also knew I wasn't ready to make the choice. The pull of this hidden connection was too strong, the lure of feeling seen and desired too intoxicating. I understood that the tipping point was near, that one misstep could unravel everything, and yet I couldn't stop myself from inching closer, testing limits I knew I shouldn't cross. And in that knowledge, the fear and desire coexisted, sharp and undeniable, a prelude to a confrontation I could no longer avoid. The moment of reckoning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet the impact was undeniable. I felt it in my chest before my mind could fully process it, a sudden awareness that nothing could remain hidden anymore. All the careful maneuvers, all the secret conversations, every small indulgence that had seemed harmless had led to a tipping point I could no longer deny. The weight of truth pressed down with a force I could neither deflect nor ignore. I realized that every word, every glance, every decision carried consequences far beyond what I had imagined. The emotional tether I had forged in secrecy had become unmanageable, entangling me in ways I hadn't foreseen. There was no turning back. The tension that had once been thrilling now demanded resolution. I could feel the strain in my body, the constant vigilance, the subtle but persistent fear that the smallest misstep could shatter everything. Regret settled over me like a heavy fog. It wasn't just guilt for what I had done or allowed myself to feel, it was a recognition of how much I had jeopardized, how many lines I had approached despite knowing they existed. My mind raced with scenarios, each one sharper and more uncomfortable than the last. The person I had become in this hidden space was both familiar and foreign, a reflection of desire and impulsivity that I barely recognized as myself. There was no relief in acknowledgement, only the acute awareness that choices had consequences that could not be ignored. I understood that I had been navigating a labyrinth of emotions with no map, relying on instinct and secrecy rather than reason or integrity. The thrill that had once seemed harmless had become a chain, binding me to the inevitability of exposure or confrontation. I thought of the relationships I had risked, the trust that had been built over years, now fragile under the weight of my own decisions. I could imagine the ripple effect of discovery, hurt, confusion, disappointment. The emotional stakes had escalated far beyond what I had anticipated. Even the prospect of explanation felt impossible, words seemed insufficient to repair the damage already in motion. Fear and longing collided inside me. The connection that had fueled excitement and self-discovery now felt like a trap, impossible to reconcile with reality. I wanted to rewind time, to erase the moments of indulgence, to restore the boundaries I had so carelessly tested. Yet I knew that once desire had been awakened, it could not simply be undone. I became hyper-aware of every interaction, every vibration, every sound, as if the world itself was waiting to reveal the consequences of my actions. The internal tension reached a peak, a combination of anticipation and dread that left me restless, tense, and painfully alert. I understood that the path forward required clarity, but clarity was elusive, replaced by a swirling mixture of fear, shame, and the remnants of desire. Reflection became unavoidable. I scrutinized my own behavior, tracing every step that had led to this precarious position. I confronted the truth of my own motives, the vulnerability that had been both a weakness and a source of exhilaration. The balance between need and morality had collapsed, leaving only the stark reality of choices made and consequences pending. I recognized that resolution would not be immediate. The fallout, whenever it came, would demand accountability, introspection, and perhaps loss. The tension that had carried me through weeks of secrecy had reached its limit, and I felt the full weight of what I had allowed myself to experience. Each heartbeat echoed the knowledge that nothing would be the same again. And yet, in the midst of fear and uncertainty, there remained a quiet understanding that life had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the same person who had entered this hidden world of temptation. The experience had left its mark, an indelible awareness of vulnerability, desire, and consequence. And in that awareness, the story did not end. It hung in balance, unresolved, a tension between what had been and what would come, waiting for the inevitable confrontation that would demand honesty, choice, and perhaps a reckoning that could not be avoided.